was. But we all know that failure is not an option. There is no planet B. We must solve this problem. The science dictates that we solve this problem. It is time to stop denying the science and start deploying the climate solutions. Admiral Titley, we've heard a lot about temperature measurements today. When I'm feeling sick and I go to the doctor, she takes my temperature, but the doctor always checks my blood pressure, listens to my heart and lungs, and looks at my ears, eyes, and throat to get a broader assessment of my health. This chart behind me is NOAA's assessment of the Earth's climatic vital signs. Yes, temperatures are going up, but so is the heat in the ocean, the sea level and the humidity, and snow and glaciers and Arctic sea ice are going down. Do you agree, Dr. Titley, that a wide range of independent observations indicate that the planet is warming and the climate is changing, and that there are no emergency rooms for planets, and we have to engage in preventative care?
Yes, sir.
What would you say is the basis for your decision? Is it based on data, or is your answer based on dogma?
It's based on the evidence, sir.
It's based on the evidence, and I agree with you, Admiral, and I thank you so much for your service to our country, both in the active Navy and here today before this committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Markey. Senator Nelson.
Dr. Curry wanted to respond to Senator.
Is it possible for me to respond? You basically.
I did not ask you a question.
Really? Why can't she respond, Senator?
Okay,
Dr. Curry,
you impugned her integrity. I think she's entitled to.
You are welcome to respond, Dr.
I was basically called a denier that I'm denying science. Did you read my written testimony? Are you aware that the IPCC and the consensus has no explanation for the increase of ice in the Antarctic? Are you aware that they have no explanation for the fact that the rate of sea level rise from 1920 to 1950 was as large, if not larger, as it currently is? Are you aware that temperatures have been warming for more than 200 years, and that in the 20th century, 40% of the warming occurred before 1950, when carbon dioxide was not a factor in the warming? Okay, and I could go on and on. Many of these issues are raised in my written testimony, and most of it is pulled from the IPCC itself. The IPCC has an explanation for, so it says, for warming during the period 1975 to 2000. It doesn't have an explanation for the flat period since 2000. It doesn't have an explanation for the early century.
Doctor, as I just said in my testimony, corroborated by Dr. Titley, this is the warmest year ever recorded. Last year is the warmest year ever recorded until this year. This is the warmest November ever recorded. October is the warmest October ever recorded. You do not have an answer for that, Dr. May.
Yes.
You continue to ignore the chart which Dr. Titley has over his left shoulder. He has documented for this committee the warming trend, which is inexorable, inevitable in terms of its consequences unless we take action here. That's the science you're having a hard time in responding to.
The issue
here,
is
Dr.
what is causing the warming. Is it natural variability, or is it humans?
Like Galileo, he said, no, the science.
Are you aware?
The science is clear. You are depending upon something that perhaps is God-made rather than dependent upon something that is man-made, which is anthropogenic and documented by 97% of all of the science.
Are you saying there's no natural variability, Senator? There were alligators at the North Pole. What was that? Was that you in your SUV?
What I am saying is that this warming is something that, while it may have a variability year to year in specific parts of the planet, that the trend is straight up.
Yeah. Do you know what the Little Ice Age was, Senator?
And again, it is climate change. We had 110 inches of snow in Boston last year, with measurements of water 21 degrees warmer than normal off of the coast of Massachusetts. Okay, this was an unusual event for us. The warming of the ocean intensifies the amount of precipitation when Arctic air hits that water. Now, if you want to deny that, if you want to ignore that these changes are taking place and that they're having a dramatic impact, then you are in the right place.
Do you know what the
You are at
winters
right
were like
witness.
at Plymouth
You are at the
Rock?
right witness.
Do you know what the winters were like at Plymouth Rock, Senator?
Well, here is the thing.
You don't. How long has your family been in Massachusetts?
We are new arrivals, and I have to admit,
You should have been there in 1750.
the Irish weren't arriving in 1750, so I apologize for being late to the country, and I'll have to chastise my grandparents for not leaving until the economic conditions in 1902 forced them here. But that notwithstanding, there is as much consensus that man is causing climate change as there is in Galileo's original theory. And
What percentage of climate change is man causing, Senator?
Excuse me, sir?
What percentage of climate change is anthropogenic?
Well, according to the scientists who are in Paris right now, which would fill pretty much the entire space of the building in which we're in right now, and the number of deniers would still be the ones who are active.
Yeah, what's the percentage, Senator?
Are you aware of a recent survey of the professional members of the American Meteorological Society? When asked the question, how much is the recent change is natural versus human cause, 52% of the membership said it was majority human cause.
Dr. Titley, could you respond to that question in terms of what you believe is the amount of warming that is relatable to human activity?
Yeah, thanks, Senator. Right now, there is, as has been pointed out, there are natural variations, things like volcanoes, things like changes in sunlight, and then there's something called internal variations. These are the oscillations or basically the back and forths of the ocean currents. So even if you had no change in forcing, but what we are doing is we are changing in forcing, and I think the IPCC has come down pretty strong along with multiple National Academy panels saying that the human-caused forcing is very, very significant. That doesn't mean there isn't natural variability. It doesn't mean there is not internal variability. But the human-caused forcing is very significant, and that's, I think, what we need to deal with.
Thank you, Dr.
I agree with you, and I agree with this Pope. I disagree with the Pope in 1632. This Pope is correct in.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. All right, we're going to have a second round, and then the hearing will conclude. I want to start, Dr. Curry. When Senator Markey was haranguing you, he said that you had no response to his assertion that 2014 was the hottest year on record. Am I correct that NASA stated that assertion, that 2014 was the hottest year on record, that they had a 38% level of confidence in that, which means that 62%, or substantially more likely than not, 2014 was not the hottest year on record? Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, basically 2014 was, according to the NASA and NOAA data sets, in a statistical tie with 2010 and 2005. The UK data set, which has, I think, more credible error bars on their data set, found that it was in the top 10 warmest years. They couldn't fine-tune it any more than that, given the great uncertainties in the reconstruction of global surface temperature data. And I think the uncertainty levels are really too low on all of those estimates, in my opinion.
And indeed, NOAA included 2014, 2010, 2005, 2013, and 1998, 5 different years, as potentially being tied for being the warmest.
Correct.
The last hearing I chaired, when Mr. Mayor, who should have been sitting next to you, testified, he told the subcommittee, quote, "Our planet is cooking and heating up and warming." Does the evidence and data we've been discussing support the assertion that the planet is cooking?
Not cooking, no.
And indeed, another reference was made by Senator Markey to the measurements. Now, I would note, none of the Democratic senators who participated in a press conference earlier today saying, how dare you ask the data, not a single Democratic senator addressed the satellite data. Not a single Democratic senator addressed the fact that for 18 years, there has been no significant warming recorded. Because I suppose it is contrary to their computer model and to their political desire to massively increase government control of the economy and impose trillions of dollars of cost on people who can't afford it. But let's turn to the different measurements, not the satellite data, and if we can put up the next two charts. These next two charts are from the United States Historical Climate Network. These are the measurements of the thermometers that are measuring climate change. And these in particular record the adjustments that NOAA has done to the climate data. Chart on the left, you can see that between 1900 and 1960, NOAA made relatively few adjustments, and they were relatively minor. And then we see that for the more recent years, they've been adjusting them upwards. And the adjustments consistently are upwards. They're never adjusting downward. Now, the chart on the right likewise looks at the raw numbers are on the top. The raw numbers demonstrate a fair degree of uniformity. But the adjusted numbers, the old temperatures are cooler and the new temperatures are warmer.
Well, there's a number of different groups who do global temperature data sets, and they have different methods for dealing with spatial representativeness, missing data, changes in temperature, measuring instrumentation, adjusting for the time of day, all sorts of different adjustments that they make. And the adjustments, as you can see, are rather huge. Okay, so should we, to me, the error bars should really be much bigger if they're making such a large adjustment. So we really don't know too much about what's going on in terms of, it's a great deal of uncertainty. Yes, I do believe that we've overall been warming, but we've been warming for 200, maybe even 400 years. Okay, and that's not caused by humans. Okay, there's natural variability involved. And this is exactly what has not been sorted out. Now, the ocean temperature is the current focus of controversy. I mean, the land data sets are sort of starting to agree, but there's a great deal of controversy and uncertainty right now in the treatment of the ocean temperatures. And that has not been sorted out. And so especially looking, in the recent period, if we're trying to sort out what's going on with the hiatus or the pause, we need to look at the satellite data. I mean, this is the best data that we have, and it's global. And we need to sort out the differences between the satellite and the surface observations. And then there's the numerical weather prediction, reanalysis, data assimilation systems that give us a global view. And we haven't been really using that for climate purposes, and I think we need to. So the work is just starting in terms of trying to sort this out.
Now,
and
Dr. Curry, you said something very important there, and that you said the satellite data are the best data we have. Can you explain as a scientist why that's the case?
Well, it's global coverage. It's not a simple measurement. You have to do, a retrieval and weighting functions, and it's a complex problem, but it's reasonably well calibrated and consistent over the last 30-ish years.
And not a single Democratic senator had any response to the satellite data that demonstrates their entire theory of global warming for 18 years hasn't been happening.
Yeah, I mean, we need to sort this out rather than ignore it. I mean, this is what I'm concerned about.
And Mr. Stein, you look like you want to make a comment.
Yeah,
I want to ask a question on this because you also are quite familiar with the cooking of the books of the hockey stick, and indeed, Dr. Curry, you mentioned ClimateGate and the scientists receiving a whole lot of funding to conclude global warming was occurring and then adjusting their results to reflect that. I would note if you systematically adjust the numbers upwards for more recent temperatures, wouldn't that by definition produce a data set that proves your global warming theory is correct? And the more you add, the more warming you can find, and you don't have to actually bother looking at what the thermometer says. You just add whatever number you want.
No, that's what's fascinating about this. Could you just tell me the left-hand date on your chart, Senator? What is it? I can't quite see it from here.
On the left?
On the right-hand chart of the blue and red line, what's the...
In both of them, it's 1900, isn't it?
1900. So you look at the blue line, you look at the red line. This is the adjustment of figures that is going on now.
Yeah.
What has happened since the global warming pause is that the public does not trust the alarmist establishment to tell them what the climate will be like in the year 2050. What that chart shows is why the public is moving to a new position now where it doesn't even trust these federal agencies to tell them what the climate was like in 1950 or 1920 or 1900. And that's interesting. If these adjustments are merited, if an adjustment in the official recorded observed temperature, because Gavin Schmidt at NASA wasn't standing out by the thermometer in the year 1920, but he suddenly decides a century on, what are we now, 95 years on, that 1920's temperature needs adjusting. That tells you how uncertain the science is. I would also like, Senator, just to say a word about this whole national security thing, because I've never heard anything quite so ridiculous. We are a country in which we have an enemy overseas who so-called radicalizes suburban couples in California who go out and kill people, but we are planning now for global security threats a century hence, because the Maldives might have been swept away by water by then. The entire population of the Maldives are all Sunni Muslim, so they'll fit in perfectly fine if they all move to this Brussels suburb that produced the shooters in Paris. But climate change is irrelevant to the long-term patterns. And I cannot tell you how absurd it is to be talking about climate change as a security threat compared to, say, just to pluck at random, population. In 1920, the British Isles and British West Africa had the same population, about 45 million people, for England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales on the one hand, and what are now Nigeria, Sierra Leone, Ghana, the Gambia on the other hand. Now, the British Isles has a combined population, England, Scotland, Ireland, Wales, about 69 million, and British West Africa has a population of 250 million. So the security threat is exactly what we see in Europe at the moment, that Niger, a country that has increased its population by 50% in this century, since the year 2000, and had millions of starving people already that it couldn't feed, and is expected to increase its population tenfold by the end of the century, and all those people are just going to get on a boat and walk into Italy, Greece, Spain, Portugal. And the idea that somehow climate change's impact on that is absolutely trivial to the remorselessness of those numbers. And I understand that governments find it easier to deal with cloud cuckoo, fantasy land, saving the planet type issues. But this is a complete waste of time for an already beleaguered Defense Department having difficulty fighting the wars it's actually in right now in Afghanistan and Iraq and elsewhere, suddenly dealing with sea levels in the Maldives in the 22nd century. It's completely preposterous and a complete waste of time.
So I'll leave that aside for a moment.
Senator, you said your parents were, I think, mathematicians, statistical modelers. We've had a lot of talk today about climate science. I compiled a book that you were kind enough to mention the title of, and what was fascinating me about that book was that climate science evolves. 20 years ago, it was basically a branch of, 30 years ago, physical geography. Now it's basically computer modeling. Yet at the same time, the majority of statisticians who look at the climate models think they are grossly unprofessional. Mathematicians and statisticians who look at the way these climate models and the way the hockey stick were constructed are not on board with it at all. A majority of engineers are not on board with it. A majority of physicists, non-climate physicists, are not on board with this. So this idea that climate science is this hermetically sealed specialty that is sealed off from the rest of the world is nonsense. Climate science, you have dendrochronology types, you have statistical modeling types, and there are elements of all in the work that they do. But certain people, mathematicians, engineers, statisticians, are not on board with this. And Judith mentioned Science magazine. Nature magazine went even further. They're the two most prestigious science journals on the planet, Nature and Science. And Nature printed a statement recently from a group of climate scientists who said, quote, climate justice, unquote, climate justice is more important than democracy. So that the fake 97% consensus is no longer enough. The fake 97% consensus of so-called climate scientists now has to trump the 51% of the electorate. No science in history has conducted itself like this, and it would be unrecognizable to Sir Isaac Newton or Charles Babbage or the Curies to see a self-sustaining, malign, politico-science nexus supporting itself and excluding all other voices. It is at odds with scientific inquiry across the centuries.
In 2009, August 31st, 2009, then Senator John Kerry, as I discussed in my opening, said scientists project that the Arctic will be ice-free in the summer of 2013, not in 2050, but 4 years from now. The nice thing about this is, unlike theories that can't necessarily be disproven, this is actually a statement that can be tested by actual facts and evidence. Dr. Titley, based on your 3 decades serving in the Navy, do you agree with President Obama, who said holding a global warming summit in Europe was a powerful rebuke to the ISIS terrorist who just committed a horrific act of terrorism in Paris and indeed likewise in San Bernardino?
Senator, thanks, sir, for the question. The way I describe these geostrategic risks of climate change, climate is the risk, and it makes the threats such as ISIS, worse. So this is not an either-or. It's not a false dichotomy.
But I'm asking your judgment as a military man if you agree with President Obama that holding a global warming summit was a powerful rebuke to the ISIS terrorist. I find that statement absurd on its face. I'm asking, based on your military judgment, do you agree with the President?
We have to address both, sir. Thank you.
From your declining to answer, I take it the inference of that is that your answer is no.
My answer is, sir, we have to address both the risk of climate change and the threat of ISIS.
This hearing was a hearing to discuss facts and evidence and data rather than partisan dogma and ideology. And there are at least 7 facts that our witnesses have laid out here to which there have been, I believe, no effective response. Number 1, that carbon dioxide, rather than being a pollutant, is good for plant life. Number 2, that the Earth, right now today, is greening. Number 3, that for significant periods in history, there has been markedly more CO2 in our atmosphere, and that was prior to the Industrial Revolution, so it could not have come from the burning of fossil fuels. Number 4, that for the last 18 years, the satellite data and the weather balloon data both demonstrate no significant warming whatsoever. That fact in particular, not a single Democratic senator had an effective response to. Number 5, that the satellite data and the weather balloon data are the best evidence we have of whether warming is occurring, and that evidence, the actual data, demonstrate that it is not. Number 6, that the seas were rising more in the first half of the 20th century, prior to the significant increase in carbon dioxide emissions, than they are now. And number 8, that the computer models, the apocalyptic computer models that are telling us we need to raise every hardworking American's electric bills, gas bills, cost of living. We need to make it harder for single moms, for immigrants, for African Americans, for Hispanics, for hardworking men and women. We need to make it harder for them to make a living and make ends meet. The computer models are profoundly wrong. Not a little bit wrong, but profoundly inconsistent with the data and the evidence. None of these 8 facts tend to make it through the media gatekeepers that instead enforce, like the Inquisition, a discipline on the heretics that would dare stand in the way of their political ideology of imposing trillions of dollars of cost on people who are struggling. Policy should be driven by facts, and as John Adams said, facts are stubborn things. In addition to the number of things entered in the record, I've got a series of newspaper articles describing the persecution of so-called climate deniers that without objection are going to be entered into the record. I'm also going to enter into the record the op-ed that Senator Whitehouse wrote calling for RICO criminal prosecution of anyone who dares stand in the way of the political ideology that hurts working men and women. The hearing record is going to remain open for 2 weeks. During this time, senators are asked to submit any questions for the record, and upon receipt, the witnesses are requested to submit their written answers to the committee as soon as possible. I want to thank the witnesses for being here. I want to thank you for the time in preparing your testimony. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.